I was supposed to spend the weekend in peace, escaping the noise of the city, away from the grind. A friend of mine had a cabin up in the woods, a little retreat he called it. Honestly, I wasn't sure why he even had it. He wasn't the outdoorsy type, but he swore by it, said it was perfect for getting away from everything, and told me it was exactly what I needed. The drive was long. I'd been on the road for hours, following the winding paths through dense trees. The weather was turning ugly too. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and I could feel a storm creeping in. I hadn't really thought much about it until I reached the last stretch of road, where the cabin should be. There was no sign to mark it, just a dirt path that barely looked wide enough for my car. I parked and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air felt thick with humidity, and I had the sudden sense that I was out of place. Everything around me was still, too still. No birds, no sounds from animals. Just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere deep in the woods. My phone barely had service. I tried calling my friend to let him know I made it, but it didn't go through. I shrugged it off and walked toward the cabin. It looked the way I imagined. A small, weather-beaten place, maybe 2 rooms at most, with a porch in front. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney, but that was the only sign of life. I knocked, but no one answered. Figuring it was just my friend out exploring or grabbing some supplies, I let myself in with the key he'd left under the mat. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly cozy. There was a fireplace at the far end of the room, a small kitchen area, and a couple of armchairs by the fire. A bookshelf lined the wall, mostly filled with worn-out paperbacks. Felt lived in but not homey, like someone had come here often, but it was never quite theirs. I tossed my bag onto the couch, not really thinking about much, just glad to be out of the car. The storm outside had started to pick up. Rain hitting the roof in sharp, angry bursts, wind howling through the trees. I grabbed some firewood from the pile beside the fireplace and got it going. There was a strange smell in the air. Not bad, but earthy, musty, like wet leaves and old wood. The whole place gave off a feeling I couldn't quite explain. It was a combination of comfort and unease. It wasn't the cabin itself, though. I figured it was just the setting, the isolation. The more I sat there, the more it dawned on me how quiet it was. Too quiet. The storm outside was heavy, but even with all the rain, I expected more sounds from nature. There should have been the buzz of insects or the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but there was nothing. I put it out of my mind. After all, I came here to relax, right? I made myself a sandwich and sat by the fire, reading a book I'd grabbed from the shelf. It wasn't anything special, just something to keep me occupied. Hours passed. I didn't feel any better. It was like the darkness outside was pressing against the walls, squeezing the air tighter. I told myself I was just being paranoid, so I went to bed early. There was something about this place, though. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy rain still pounding on the roof. I tried calling my friend again. No answer. I figured he might be out for a while or just couldn't get reception. I wasn't worried yet. I spent the day reading, cooking, and taking little walks around the property. The cabin was located at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by trees that loomed taller than I imagined, their trunks thick and dark. It wasn't until late afternoon that things started to feel off. I had wandered further than I had before, down a narrow trail behind the cabin, when I noticed something strange. A small, old shack hidden between the trees. It wasn't on the map my friend had sent me before I left, and I certainly hadn't seen it when I arrived. I walked over to it, curiosity getting the better of me. The structure looked like it had been abandoned for years. Its roof sagged, and the walls were covered in moss and vines. The door was cracked open, just enough for me to see inside. I don't know why, but I stepped closer, peering inside. The air smelled of rot, like wet wood and stale air. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to get back to the cabin, but I ignored them and stepped inside. The floor creaked under my feet as I looked around. The place was filled with old tools, rusted axes, saws, and hammers all scattered haphazardly on the floor. It felt like a junkyard from a past I didn't want to know about, but there was something even more unsettling about it. In the corner, partially obscured by a pile of old rags, was a faded, yellowed sheet of paper. I pulled it out, smoothing it open, and read the few words written on it in dark ink. Asterisk, leave before it's too late. Asterisk. I froze. That sinking feeling in my stomach came back full force. I had no idea who left that note or why, but it wasn't something I could ignore. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A large, rusted nail sticking out from the floor near the wall. It seemed out of place, sticking up at an odd angle. I stepped closer to it, and just as I was about to crouch down, a sharp crack echoed through the shack. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around in a panic. I wasn't alone. The woods around me felt alive in a way that wasn't right, like they were watching me. My breath hitched in my throat, and I ran back to the cabin, not daring to look behind me. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The storm outside was raging now, thunder booming, lightning flashing in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that had been watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I sat in the darkened cabin for hours, not knowing what to do. I couldn't go back to that shack, not after seeing that note, not after hearing that noise. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something held me there. It wasn't until the next morning that I finally decided to head out, knowing that my friend would be back soon. The drive home was long and silent, and though the storm had passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the memory of the shack, the rusted nail, and that chilling note stayed with me long after I left the woods behind. When I got back to the city, I decided to do some research on the cabin. There were no mentions of it online, no records, but I found something strange. A news article from years ago about a missing person, someone who had last been seen near that area. They'd never found the person, though the search had been called off after weeks of no results. That was when I started to piece it together. The shack, the note, the rusted tools, it wasn't just a place that had been abandoned. It was a warning, and I wasn't supposed to be there. Something had been watching me, and now I was certain it wasn't just the woods. But that was it. I made it out. I wasn't stuck in some never-ending loop. I left the cabin behind and moved on with my life. But I'll never forget that feeling, that gnawing certainty that the woods never wanted me there, and that I was lucky to make it out in one piece. I had always dreamed of getting away from the noise of the city. So, when the opportunity came up to take a few days off and stay in a remote cabin, I jumped on it without hesitation. A weekend of silence, some time to myself in the middle of nowhere. It sounded perfect. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, several miles from the nearest town. I'd heard stories from people who'd gone out there, but they mostly talked about the beauty of the place, the peaceful isolation, the endless hiking trails. No one mentioned anything weird about it, so I figured it would be the perfect place to disconnect. I'm 28, a graphic designer working from home. I thought I'd spend the time catching up on some work, maybe reading a book, but mostly just relaxing. I'd rented the cabin from an older man named Hank who ran the small rental business. He was friendly enough when I arrived, though he looked a little worn out, like he hadn't seen many people in a long time. When I mentioned I was going to be alone, he hesitated for a moment but then just shrugged and handed me the key. "The cabin's simple," he said, "but it'll do you good. Just keep the door locked and don't go wandering off after dark. The woods can play tricks on you." I laughed it off, telling myself he was just trying to scare me for fun. I assumed it was his way of adding a bit of charm to the experience. People always like to make things sound a little eerie when it's just a secluded spot. But I didn't think much of it after I left his place and drove the rest of the way to the cabin. The road to the cabin wasn't great. Gravel and narrow with overgrown branches hanging down, nearly brushing against the car. The weather was cloudy when I arrived, and the wind picked up as I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, nestled in the trees. It wasn't much to look at. A simple wooden structure with a rusty tin roof, a porch that creaked under its own weight, and a chimney that hadn't been used in who knows how long. But to me, it looked like the perfect escape. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt a rush of cold air. It wasn't freezing, but it was definitely colder than I expected for this time of year. The inside was cozy enough. A small living room with a fireplace, a kitchen with an old-fashioned wood stove, and a loft above where the bedroom was. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved around, exploring the place. There was a small stack of firewood in the corner, which I was thankful for. I unpacked, set my things down, and decided to go for a walk to stretch my legs. The weather was dreary, but I didn't mind the gray skies. The woods around the cabin were thick and wild, towering trees with trunks so wide that their roots seemed to grip the earth like hands. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but I figured it was just the solitude playing tricks on my mind. The forest felt alive in its own way. Small sounds here and there, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. But there was no one else around, and that was the whole point of being out here, right? When I returned to the cabin, it was already starting to get dark. I was about to start a fire when I realized the matches I'd brought weren't working. Frustrated, I stepped outside to grab the extra matches from the car, but the moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt it. A chill in the air that wasn't there before. The wind had picked up, and the trees were creaking, bending in strange ways. I paused, looking around. The woods felt off, not in an obvious, terrifying way, but more like something was subtly different. The longer I stood there, the more I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was a sudden, sharp crack from the trees that made me jump. My first thought was that it was a branch snapping under the wind, but then I heard it again, this time closer. A snap, followed by a rustle in the underbrush. My heart rate quickened as I stepped down from the porch. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I had this nagging feeling that someone was out there, just out of sight. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I grabbed the matches from the car, rushed back inside, and locked the door behind me. I lit the fire, and for a while, I just sat there in the warmth, watching the flames flicker. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the fire or the sound of the wind outside, my mind kept drifting back to that strange feeling, like I wasn't alone. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise seemed amplified, as if the entire cabin was alive. I tossed and turned, checking the windows to make sure they were still locked, but every time I did, I felt like there was something watching me from just outside. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to get some fresh air. The night had been restless, but the daylight seemed to bring a sense of calm. I made coffee, then stepped out onto the porch again. The woods were still, quiet, and the only sound was the occasional bird call. It was almost peaceful again. But as I stood there, sipping my coffee, I noticed something odd. A footprint in the mud just outside the porch. It was fresh, as though someone had walked up to the cabin overnight. It was large, the shape of a boot, but there were no other tracks around it. The ground around the cabin was mostly dry, so it struck me as strange that just one footprint would be there. I didn't know what to make of it, but the unease from last night came rushing back. I hadn't seen anyone pass by, and I hadn't heard a vehicle. Who would be out here alone in the middle of nowhere? I went back inside, locked the door again, and spent the rest of the day working, trying not to think too much about it. The whole situation felt off, but I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. That evening, the wind started to pick up again. The weather had turned colder, and a storm was rolling in, making the trees sway more violently. I stayed inside, keeping the fire going, but as night fell, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A tapping at the window. I froze, staring at the glass, but saw nothing. I tried to shake it off, but the tapping came again, this time louder. I got up, walked to the window, and peered out into the dark. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I checked all the windows, made sure they were sealed tight, and moved away from the windowsill. The tapping continued, just out of sight. It was driving me crazy. The wind? An animal? It had to be one of those things. But no, it wasn't like any noise I'd heard before. The way it tapped, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the back of the cabin, cautiously looking around. The storm was worsening, and the rain started to fall in sheets, but the air felt different, heavier. I swept the flashlight over the ground, looking for anything, but I found nothing unusual. Just then, the sound of someone coughing echoed from somewhere deeper in the woods. It was a low, throaty cough, almost like it was being forced out, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. I froze again, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one around, no car, no sign of life besides the trees. The cough came again, a little clearer this time. Someone was out there. I ran back into the cabin, locked the door, and turned the lights off. I sat in the dark, the only sound the howling wind and the occasional tapping at the window. The storm was in full force now, and I couldn't tell if I was hearing things or if someone or something was out there, waiting. That night, I barely slept. The storm raged on outside, but I kept hearing the tapping. It never stopped. When morning finally came, I hurried to pack my things. I didn't care that I'd paid for the full weekend. I just wanted to get out. As I loaded up my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A fresh set of footprints in the mud leading right up to the cabin. They weren't mine, and they weren't Hank's either. I didn't stay to investigate further. I jumped in my car, drove as fast as I could down the gravel road, and didn't stop until I reached the town. When I got back, I went straight to Hank's house, but he wasn't home. His daughter, who ran the place while he was away, told me he had been acting strange lately, talking about how the woods were changing. She said he'd been spending more time in town and had told her to be careful, but she didn't elaborate. I didn't ask for any more details. I paid for my stay and drove back to the city. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, lingering in the corners of my mind. I never went back to that cabin. Looking back, I still don't know what happened that weekend. Was I just exhausted, imagining things in the storm? Or was there really someone or something out there? I never found out, but I've learned one thing. When you get that feeling, that instinct that tells you something's wrong, you shouldn't ignore it. Trust it. I never thought I'd be the type of person to end up in a story like this. It always seemed like something that happened to other people. People who didn't know better, people who made dumb mistakes. But I knew what I was doing. Or at least I thought I did. It started with the need to get away. Life had been suffocating, and I wanted a break. Just some time to clear my head, away from work, from city noise, from everything. I had this idea in my head that I needed to be alone in the wilderness, like some kind of reset button for my mind. A week in a cabin, just me, the trees, and the quiet. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just peace. I found the place online, some private rental listing deep in the woods of northern Montana. The pictures looked perfect, small, rustic, but well-maintained. The description said it had all the basics: running water, a wood-burning stove, a generator for electricity. Just what I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. I followed the GPS for hours until I lost service. After that, I had to rely on the printed directions the owner had emailed me. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. Thick trees crowded in on both sides, and the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting. The place looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. It was small, just one room with a lofted bed, a kitchenette, and a fireplace. There was a shed out back for firewood and tools. Beyond that, nothing but forest. The nearest town was at least an hour away. I unloaded my supplies, double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, and settled in for the night. Everything was fine at first. The silence was thick but not unsettling. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and read a book until my eyes felt heavy. When I climbed into bed, I remember thinking how good it felt to be so far away from everything. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I woke up a few times, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. No sounds, no movement, just an eerie stillness that felt unnatural. But I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. The second night, things changed. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard something outside. A soft crunch, like footsteps on dead leaves. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, but then I heard it again. Closer. Slow, deliberate steps. I turned off the lantern and waited, heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped. I listened so hard my ears started to ring. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I had imagined it. I went to bed uneasy but managed to sleep. The next morning, I checked outside. There were tracks in the dirt near the treeline. Human tracks. I felt a spike of fear but forced myself to stay calm. Maybe a hiker had passed through. Maybe it was nothing. That day, I tried to shake it off. I chopped firewood, went for a short hike, tried to enjoy the solitude. But the feeling lingered. Couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. That night, the noises came back. More footsteps, circling the cabin. I sat up in bed, barely breathing. The steps stopped and started again, like someone was testing how close they could get without being noticed. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the window. Nothing. But when I turned it off, the footsteps started again. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself outside to look around. More tracks, closer this time. Whoever it was, they had walked right up to the cabin walls. I should have left then. I don't know why I didn't. Stubbornness, maybe, or the unwillingness to believe that I was actually in danger. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and wedged a piece of wood under the handle to keep it from turning. I kept the poker by my side, listening. The footsteps came again, but this time they didn't stop at the trees. They came right up to the door, a slow, dragging sound, like fingertips scraping against the wood. Then the handle rattled. I held my breath. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then, something even worse, the sound of breathing just outside the door. My chest tightened. I gripped the poker so hard my knuckles ached. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't move. Finally, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated. I waited until the sun came up before I dared to move. When I finally opened the door, my stomach turned to ice. On the ground, in the dirt, were words. Words carved into the earth with a stick, deep and deliberate. Leave now. I packed my things in minutes, throwing everything into my truck without caring how. I didn't look back. I didn't check for more tracks. I didn't care. I drove faster than I ever have in my life, tires kicking up dust as I sped down that dirt road. When I finally reached the highway, my hands were shaking so badly I had to pull over. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. If I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I'd be here to tell this story. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when I pulled up to the small cabin tucked between a cluster of trees. It was exactly as I had imagined. Rustic, quiet, isolated. I'd rented it for a weekend getaway, hoping for some peace and solitude to clear my head. The cabin was far from any town, nestled deep in the forest, a 2-hour drive from the nearest gas station. Perfect for someone like me, who needed to escape the chaos of daily life. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and looked around. The air was crisp, the kind of air that makes you feel like you're breathing in something fresh and untouched. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. The cabin itself was made of old logs, dark and weathered, with a slanted roof that seemed to sag just a bit in the middle. It had a porch, complete with a rocking chair and a small wooden table. There was no one around for miles. Perfect. I had deliberately chosen this place to escape people, to find some space to think. There were no neighbors, no loud cars, no distractions. As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was musty, like old wood and forgotten memories. The cabin was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace taking up one wall. The furniture was sparse but comfortable, an old couch with a patterned throw blanket, a wooden dining table, and a small kitchen area. It looked exactly like what I had envisioned. Simple, almost abandoned, but still functional. There were no modern luxuries here, just basic necessities. I liked it that way. I tossed my duffel bag onto the couch and moved around the cabin, settling in. I opened the window to let some fresh air in and then turned on the overhead light. The bulb flickered before staying on, casting a dim, yellow glow. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, and there was a small bookshelf by the window. It seemed like a place someone would come to for rest, not to stay long. I found a logbook on the kitchen counter, dusty and old, with a handwritten note on the cover that simply read, "Welcome." I opened it, curious, and flipped through the pages. There were entries from other visitors, mostly short comments about how peaceful the place was, how quiet it was. Nothing out of the ordinary. I closed it and put it back, deciding to just enjoy the peace. The first night passed without anything strange happening. I had a light dinner, read for a bit, and then went to bed. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside, the sun already high in the sky. It was warm enough to step outside in just a t-shirt, and I decided to take a walk through the woods around the cabin. There was a small trail that led deeper into the forest, and I figured I'd follow it to clear my head. The forest was dense, with thick trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. As I walked, I felt the weight of the silence pressing in around me. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful anymore. It was too complete, too still. Even the birds had stopped singing. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. After about an hour of walking, I reached a small clearing with a pond in the middle. The water was still, almost unnaturally so, and reflected the trees like a mirror. I sat down on a large rock by the edge of the pond, taking in the view. The peacefulness of the moment was only disturbed by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I was just about to stand up and head back when I saw something in the distance, a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I squinted, I could see it more clearly. A person standing in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. They didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but it was unmistakably a person. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. My heart began to race. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. There was no response. The figure just stood there, unmoving. It felt like the entire forest had gone silent, as though holding its breath along with me. I waited for what felt like forever, but the figure didn't budge. Finally, I took a step back, my eyes locked on the shape in the distance. The moment I turned around to leave, the figure vanished. I blinked and looked back, but there was no one there, just trees. I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing. There was no logical explanation for what I had seen. Maybe it was someone else staying nearby, though I couldn't imagine who. There were no other cabins that I had seen on my drive up, and the closest town was miles away. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the isolation was starting to get to me, but as I stepped inside the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavier now, and the quiet seemed almost oppressive. I tried to relax, but it was hard to focus on anything. My thoughts kept drifting back to that figure. That night, I decided to sleep with the window closed. I wasn't sure why, but it just felt like the right thing to do. The wind had picked up outside, and the sound of branches scraping against the walls made the whole place feel more alive, as if it were watching me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my mind. It was late, probably around midnight, when I heard it. A knock. It was soft at first, almost like someone was tapping on the wall. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, listening, and then heard it again. Another knock, louder this time. The sound was coming from outside, right by the window. My body went cold with fear. I got up slowly, moving quietly so I wouldn't make a sound. I peeked through the curtains, my heart racing in my throat. There was nothing there, just darkness and trees. But the knocks continued. Not on the window, but now it sounded like it was coming from the door. I didn't know what to do. Should I answer it? Should I call someone? But I was alone. There was no one around. I could only wait and listen to the slow, rhythmic tapping, each knock sending a shiver down my spine. Then it stopped, just like that. The silence returned, only now it felt even more suffocating. The next morning, I packed my things quickly, not even bothering to eat or drink. I wasn't staying another night in that cabin. I didn't care how beautiful the woods were or how peaceful the cabin was supposed to be. Something was wrong, something I couldn't explain, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it was. As I loaded up my car, I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning every shadow, every movement, expecting to see that figure again. But there was nothing. The woods were quiet, unnervingly so. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine and started the engine. I was halfway down the dirt road when I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a figure standing on the porch of the cabin. The same figure I had seen by the pond. This time, it wasn't just standing there. It was watching me, its head tilted at an odd angle, like it was studying me. I slammed on the gas, not looking back again. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I wasn't going back there. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station and pulled out my phone. I didn't have much service out in the woods, but I had enough to send a message to the rental agency. I told them everything that had happened, how I had seen someone, how the knocks had come at night, and how the figure had been outside when I left. Their response was quick and to the point. They had no idea what I was talking about. No one else had rented the cabin recently, and they hadn't received any complaints. But that's when the story took a turn. The agent mentioned something strange. The cabin had been empty for years. There hadn't been any guests for a long time. In fact, they said, the cabin had been abandoned for decades before it was finally rented out to me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I sat in my car, staring at the phone in disbelief. I wasn't sure what had happened that weekend, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, I wasn't going back to that cabin. I had never been the type to believe in superstitions or things that went bump in the night. I've always considered myself grounded, level-headed. But looking back on what happened at that cabin, I can't help but wonder if I missed something, or if it was all just a series of unfortunate events that piled up in a way that's hard to explain. It all started in the summer of 2019. I was 28 at the time, fresh off a breakup and needing to get away from the noise of everyday life. So, when my buddy Jake suggested a weekend cabin retreat, it seemed like the perfect chance to clear my head. He had found a cabin out in the woods, far away from any kind of city or hustle, just nature and peace. The kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. The cabin wasn't fancy, just a simple, 2-story wooden structure, tucked away in the woods on the outskirts of a small town. The nearest neighbor was about 3 miles away. We'd rented it for the weekend, and Jake made it sound like it was going to be the perfect escape. No distractions, no technology, just us, some beers, and plenty of time to talk, relax, and get away from the stress of life. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the trees. The cabin had a rustic charm to it, with its old, creaky wooden floors and the faint smell of pine and dampness in the air. It looked like it hadn't been used much recently, but there was something oddly inviting about it. Jake was already in high spirits, cracking jokes and slinging a bag over his shoulder as we unloaded the car. I followed him inside, taking in the sparse but cozy interior. There was a large stone fireplace in the center of the living room, a couple of mismatched chairs around it, and a small kitchen in the corner. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms, each with a bed covered in thick, woolen blankets. It wasn't much, but it felt like home. The first night was uneventful. We cracked open some beers, talked about old times, and joked about how peaceful it was. As the night wore on, we decided to head to bed early to make the most of our weekend. The quiet was something I wasn't used to. Back home, there was always the hum of traffic, distant voices, the clinking of dishes from neighbors. But out here, it was almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Every creak of the floorboards, the rustle of leaves in the trees, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I shook it off. It was just the isolation. Nothing to worry about. The first sign that something was wrong came early the next morning. I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch brushing up against the side of the cabin. But when I got up to look, there was nothing. The trees outside were still, the air still and quiet. Jake was already up and brewing coffee when I came downstairs. He didn't seem bothered by the odd noise. "Must be a squirrel or something," he said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. But as the day wore on, things started to feel off. The air felt thicker, heavier, like something was pressing in on us. It wasn't the weather. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. But every time I stepped outside, it felt like the woods were closing in around me. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But there was never anyone there. By the second night, things had gotten stranger. Jake and I were sitting outside around a small fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about anything and everything. The fire crackled and popped, and the night was so dark that the stars seemed to shine brighter than usual. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was walking around the cabin. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then Jake heard it too. He stood up, looking toward the trees, his brow furrowed. "You hear that?" he asked. I nodded. It wasn't just in my head. The footsteps stopped just short of the tree line. I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the firelight. We waited in silence, the crackling fire the only sound between us. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again. But this time, they were closer. They were right outside the cabin. My heart started to race. Jake and I exchanged nervous glances, neither of us knowing what to do. We were far away from any help, in a cabin that had no phone signal. If someone was out there, we were completely alone. Jake grabbed a flashlight from inside and walked toward the door. I followed, but I was hesitant. I didn't want to open that door into whatever was out there. I wanted to just pretend it wasn't happening, but my gut told me otherwise. Jake opened the door slowly, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light swept across the yard, illuminating the trees and the space between them. There was nothing there, no one, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I knew we weren't alone. We spent the rest of the night in uneasy silence. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with possibilities. What had been out there, and why was it watching us? The following day, the weirdness continued. Jake tried to shake it off, but I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was. We spent most of the day inside, trying to distract ourselves with games and movies, but the air outside still felt heavy, oppressive. The birds weren't chirping, the wind wasn't blowing, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves. By the time evening rolled around, I had had enough. I wanted to leave. I didn't feel safe here anymore, and I didn't think Jake did either, despite his bravado. I suggested we pack up and head home, but Jake dismissed the idea. He didn't want to waste the trip, and he kept insisting it was nothing. That night, we decided to take a walk through the woods. I wasn't sure why, but something in me told me we needed to see if we could find any signs of who or what was out there. We grabbed flashlights, heading down the narrow trail that wound through the trees. The moonlight barely cut through the canopy, leaving the forest in near total darkness. The silence was overwhelming. We didn't get far before we saw something. A figure, a man, standing just outside the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out the silhouette. He was tall, wearing a jacket that looked too heavy for the weather, and he wasn't moving, just standing there watching us. Jake froze, his flashlight flickering nervously. I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. I could only stare at the figure, my mind racing. What was he doing here? Was he just a hunter? A local? Or was there something more to him? The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge us. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he slowly turned and walked deeper into the woods, disappearing from sight. Jake was the first to speak. "We need to go. Now." We didn't argue. We turned and sprinted back to the cabin, not stopping until we were inside, the door locked behind us. We spent the rest of the night in fear, not daring to go outside, not wanting to risk seeing that figure again. In the morning, we packed up quickly, more eager to leave than we had been to arrive. The drive back home was quiet, neither of us saying much. But when we reached the edge of town, Jake turned to me and said something that still haunts me. "You think we were being watched the whole time?" I couldn't answer him. I wasn't sure, but I didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. We both knew something had been out there, something we couldn't explain. I've never gone back to that cabin, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone was watching us the whole time. The kind of watching that doesn't stop. The kind that waits for you to slip up, to make a mistake so it can close in. And I don't think we were ever meant to know what it wanted. The night I spent at the cabin in the woods is something I'll never forget. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something, or someone, was watching me. It wasn't just the isolation that got to me, though that was unsettling in its own right. It wasn't even the strange noises that came from the trees after dark, or the unsettling stillness of the woods. No, what bothered me the most was how everything felt off, like I had wandered into a place where I didn't belong. It started as a simple idea. I needed a break. Life in the city had been draining me. The noise, the crowds, the constant hustle. It was too much. So, when I saw the ad for a remote cabin rental in the forest, I jumped at the chance. The price was ridiculously low, which should have been my first red flag, but I was desperate for some peace and quiet. The cabin was located about 3 hours outside of the nearest town, nestled in a forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. The kind of place you'd only find if you were looking for it. It wasn't on any main road. You had to take a series of winding paths, barely wide enough for a car, and then hike a mile or so through dense woods to reach it. No phone service, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. When I arrived, the first thing that hit me was the silence. I had expected some bird calls, maybe the rustle of wind through the trees, but there was nothing. It was so quiet that it felt oppressive, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The cabin was small but cozy, a log structure with a stone chimney, a porch that creaked underfoot, and a single room with a lofted bed. It was old, but well-kept. The kind of place that might have been charming if you were in a group, but alone it felt too empty. There was a small wood stove for heat, a table, a few mismatched chairs, and a small kitchenette. The kind of place that made you feel like the world was miles away, and no one would find you if you screamed. I spent the first few hours unpacking and setting up. It wasn't long before the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers across the ground. I built a fire in the stove and made myself a simple meal. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, just me and my thoughts, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to sway unnaturally in the breeze, or how the shadows seemed to shift, as though they were alive. Maybe it was the way the air felt heavier as the night fell, like the weight of the forest was pressing in on me. As the fire crackled and popped, I tried to push those thoughts aside. I had come here to escape after all, but the longer I sat, the more uneasy I became. I kept hearing faint sounds from the woods, branches snapping, a faint rustling of leaves. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing there, just the darkness. I tried to distract myself, reading a book I had brought along, but the words seemed to blur on the page. My mind kept wandering. Every little sound outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I would tell myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just the usual noises of the forest. This felt different. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I made my way up to the loft, where the bed was, and settled in under the heavy blankets. The darkness outside was absolute, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow everything. Even with the fire still burning in the stove, the room felt cold. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft thump, then another, followed by a creaking sound. I froze. The noise came from below. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling, the wood groaning with the temperature change. But then it happened again, this time louder. A distinct, deliberate sound. Thump, creak, thump. I got out of bed and crept down the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. I walked over to the door, which led outside, and peeked out through the crack. Nothing. The woods were as still as before, the trees barely moving. I stood there for a moment, feeling a cold sweat break out across my back. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I stepped back into the cabin, closing the door behind me. The strange noises had stopped, but the silence that followed was suffocating. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was I hearing things? Had I imagined the sounds? I returned to the loft, my heart still pounding in my chest. I pulled the covers over me, hoping that sleep would come soon, but it didn't. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. Each creak felt like an intrusion, like something was moving in the dark. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, I couldn't tell. Just as I was starting to feel myself relax, I heard it again. This time it was closer. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the porch. I didn't want to go down there, didn't want to look, but I had to. Something inside me told me I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and made my way to the stairs, my legs shaking with every step. The porch was dark, the light from the cabin barely illuminating the steps outside. I stepped onto the wooden planks, my breath visible in the cold night air. The beam of the flashlight swept across the area, landing on the corner of the porch where I saw nothing. But then something shifted, a shape, a movement. I swung the flashlight toward it, my pulse racing. But the moment the light hit, the shape was gone, just a shadow swallowed by the darkness. I stood there for a long moment, my body frozen in place, but there was no sound now. No more thumping, no more creaking. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with thoughts of bears or coyotes, but none of those seemed right. Whatever was out there, it wasn't behaving like an animal. It was deliberate. It was intelligent. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in a restless haze, tossing and turning in the bed. The sounds never came back, but the fear remained. Something was out there, something I couldn't explain. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I had imagined the noises, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was wrong. This place was wrong. I packed my things and left the cabin that morning, my nerves shot and my mind still reeling from the night before. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. It stood there, silent and still, like it was waiting for me to come back. I never went back. I remember the trip to the cabin all too well. It was supposed to be a quiet, relaxing time away from the city. Just me, the mountains, and a place to clear my head. I had been working nonstop, burnt out, and needed space to breathe. A friend had suggested a remote cabin he had stayed in before, far from the main roads, deep in the woods with no cell service. Perfect place to disconnect, he said. I left early in the morning, the drive taking longer than expected due to winding back roads. The last stretch was nothing more than a dirt path through dense trees, branches scraping the sides of my truck. It felt like I was going deeper into nowhere. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch and a small shed out back. There was no electricity, just gas lamps and a wood stove for heat. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the woods stretching endlessly in every direction. A creek ran nearby, its faint gurgling sound the only thing breaking the silence. It was peaceful. That first day, I unpacked, gathered firewood, and explored a little. The isolation didn't bother me. I had spent time in the woods before, hiking and camping, but something about this place felt different. The silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy. The first night, I lay in bed listening to the woods. The occasional rustling outside was normal. Deer, maybe a raccoon, but then I heard something different. It wasn't movement. It was stillness, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like something was waiting, watching. I convinced myself it was my imagination, the unfamiliar setting playing tricks on my mind. I forced myself to sleep. The second day, I hiked around, familiarizing myself with the area. I found an old, rusted axe buried in a tree stump behind the cabin. The handle was split, and the blade was dull, but something about it unsettled me. That evening, I built a fire outside and cooked a simple meal. As the sun set, the woods felt different, more enclosed, like the trees had shifted, growing tighter together. The silence returned, deeper this time. I sat on the porch, watching the dark. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but no, it was real. Far off in the tree line, just past where the fire's glow faded, there was a figure. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I told myself it was a tree, a shadow, anything but what it looked like. I went inside, locked the door, and sat by the window, staring out. The fire outside crackled, casting flickering light across the yard, but the figure never moved. I didn't sleep much that night. The third day, I walked to where I had seen the figure. Nothing was there. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. Just the woods, stretching endlessly. Maybe I really had imagined it. But that night, I heard something new. Not rustling, not silence. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. It was close. Too close. I reached for the hunting knife I had brought with me, gripping it tight. The breathing stopped. Then, a slow, deliberate scraping sound. Fingernails? A knife? Something dragging along the wooden wall. I stood, moving as quietly as I could toward the door. The sound circled the cabin, slow and methodical. I stayed up all night, waiting for it to return, but eventually, the noise faded, and the woods fell silent again. The next morning, I found marks on the porch railing. Long, deep scratches, like something with claws had raked across the wood. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I told myself it was an animal, a bear maybe. I had come out here to be alone, and I wasn't about to let fear chase me away. That was my mistake. That night, the scratching returned, but this time, it was louder, closer. I locked the doors, blocked the windows, but it didn't stop. Then came the knocking. Slow, deliberate knocks on the wooden walls. Not random, measured, as if whatever was out there wanted me to know it was real. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag. I opened the front door, stepping onto the porch, and froze. Footprints, human footprints, leading from the woods to my door. Bare feet. I left everything except my keys and ran to my truck. Started on the first try, and I tore down that dirt path without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, didn't breathe until I had cell service again. When I got home, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had been overtired, paranoid, my mind playing tricks on me. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. A week later, my friend called, said he had just gotten back from the same cabin. He asked if I had seen the footprints too. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. I had rented a small cabin deep in the Oregon woods, away from the noise of the city, hoping to spend some time alone. Work had been stressful, and I needed to clear my head. The idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of a nearby creek seemed perfect. I had no idea what I was walking into. The drive up took longer than expected. The dirt road leading to the cabin was winding and rough, with branches scraping against the sides of my truck. My phone lost signal about 20 miles before I even reached the property, but that was expected. I had come prepared, plenty of food, a flashlight, extra batteries, and even a rifle just in case any wild animals got too close. When I arrived, the place was exactly how the listing had described it. A one-bedroom wooden cabin with a front porch, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. The nearest neighbor was about 5 miles away. Perfect. The air was crisp, and the sky was beginning to darken as the sun set behind the trees. I unpacked my things, set some firewood by the fireplace, and settled in. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The woods were too quiet. I was used to the hum of traffic, distant voices, the occasional siren. Here, the silence felt unnatural. Every small noise, a rustling in the trees, the creak of the wooden walls, felt amplified. I kept my rifle within reach, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. In the morning, I made coffee and stepped outside. The air was cold, but the view was beautiful. The forest stretched for miles, thick and endless. I took a walk around the property, checking out the creek about 50 yards away. I noticed footprints near the water, too big to be mine, too fresh to be old. Maybe a hunter had passed through, or maybe not. I shook it off and spent the rest of the day chopping firewood and reading inside. As the sun started to set, I cooked a simple meal and sat on the porch, watching the trees sway. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching me. I froze, gripping the armrest of my chair. My first thought was that it was a hunter or a hiker who got lost, but they weren't moving, just standing there, barely visible in the dim light. I felt a cold sweat form on my neck. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. "Hello," I called out. No response, no movement. I backed into the cabin and locked the door. My rifle was by the fireplace. I grabbed it, checked to make sure it was loaded, and stood by the window watching. The figure was gone. I barely slept that night, listening to every creak, every gust of wind. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. But when I woke up, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, leading from the tree line to my porch. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and made sure my rifle was loaded. My first instinct was to leave, but my truck was parked a good walk from the cabin, down the winding path where I couldn't see it from here. If someone was out there, they could be waiting. The day passed in a haze of paranoia. I didn't go outside. I barely ate. As the sun set again, I braced myself for another long night. I sat in the dark with my rifle in my lap, waiting. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the porch steps. My grip on the rifle tightened. I held my breath. The doorknob rattled. I raised the gun, aiming directly at the door. Silence. Then, the footsteps retreated. Slowly, back down the steps. I sat frozen, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, the first hint of dawn broke through the trees, and I exhaled. That was it. I was leaving. I grabbed my bags, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and stepped outside. My eyes darted around, scanning the tree line, the porch, the road ahead. Nothing. I walked quickly to my truck, my heart hammering. When I reached it, I unlocked the door, threw my bags in, and slid into the driver's seat. Just as I started the engine, I noticed something in the side mirror, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow road. My hands were shaking, my pulse racing. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, where my phone finally regained signal. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say. There was no crime, no evidence, just footprints and fear. But I know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods. I was 29 when I decided to get away from it all. Life had become a blur of work, obligations, and stress. Every day felt like I was running on empty. That's when I saw an ad online for a secluded cabin rental in the Appalachian Mountains, far from the reach of cell phones and Wi-Fi. It seemed perfect. A week of solitude, surrounded by nature, a chance to reset. No distractions, just me and the woods. The cabin was small, built from old, weathered wood, and sat on a property that had been in the same family for generations. The photos showed a cozy, rustic interior with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and wide windows that let in the sunlight. The cabin was about an hour's drive from the nearest town, and the ad mentioned that it was located near a trailhead that led to miles of hiking paths. No neighbors for miles, just pure wilderness. I booked it without much thought, just the way I usually made decisions when I was feeling overwhelmed, quickly and without second guessing. The drive there was longer than I expected. The last stretch of road was a narrow, winding dirt path that dipped and curved between thick trees, with rocks and roots poking through the ground. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. A chill had settled in the air, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders as I grabbed my bag from the trunk. The cabin looked just like the pictures. The porch creaked underfoot, and the wooden door opened with a loud groan. Inside, the smell of pine and old wood filled the air. It had that earthy scent that made you feel like you were far away from civilization. The fireplace looked ready to be lit. The bed was simple but inviting, and the small dining table by the window offered a perfect view of the forest. I spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in. The place was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees outside. I lit a fire in the hearth, threw on some music, and started a pot of coffee, hoping to relax. But the longer I stayed, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just little things, like the way the wind would change direction suddenly, or how the house seemed to creak when no one was near it, or the way the shadows outside the window seemed to move, though I knew there was no one out there. I tried to brush it off as the result of too many stressful months, but a part of me couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. That night, I slept fitfully. The wind howled outside, and the branches scraped against the windows like fingers, but it wasn't that which kept me awake. It was the sound of something moving around outside. I could hear it faintly just beyond the trees, a kind of dragging, scraping noise, like someone was walking on all fours. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but bears didn't walk like that, and I knew I had to check. The thought nagged at me for hours until I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed the flashlight, slipped on my shoes, and stepped outside into the cold, moonlit night. The woods were still. The only sound was the distant rush of a creek nearby. I walked around the cabin, scanning the ground with the beam of the flashlight. Nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything. I shook my head, laughed at myself, and went back inside. The next day, I decided to go for a hike. I needed to clear my head, to remind myself that I was safe here, that there was nothing to fear. The trailhead was just a short walk from the cabin, a winding path that led deep into the forest. As I walked, I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the occasional bird call, the rustle of a squirrel darting across the trail. It was beautiful, almost too beautiful, in a way that felt overwhelming. After a few hours, I stopped to rest at a small clearing where the trail opened up to a view of the mountains in the distance. The sun was high in the sky now, and I felt like I had found peace. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of my vision. I thought it was a tree or a large rock, but as I turned my head, I saw it clearly. A figure, standing at the edge of the woods watching me. It wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still. The figure was tall, wearing something dark, blending in with the shadows. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just a person. The figure was too still, too unnatural. I could see no details, just a vague outline, like someone had draped themselves in black fabric and stood motionless. I stood frozen. My mind raced. Was it someone else renting a cabin nearby? Was it a hunter, a hiker? But why wasn't it moving? Why was it standing there? I quickly grabbed my things and backed away down the trail. I didn't look back. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get back to the cabin, to lock the door and never go outside again. When I got back, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. I was stressed, tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. I spent the rest of the day inside, pacing, trying to distract myself with books and music. But every time I looked out the window, my heart skipped a beat. The figure I'd seen was still there, lingering in my thoughts. Its image burned into my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to the wind howl outside, waiting for that dragging sound again. Came just like before, that same scraping noise, so faint but unmistakable. It was closer now, closer than it had been the night before. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to stay in that cabin anymore, but I didn't want to leave either. I was far from the nearest town, and my car was parked miles down the road. It felt like I was trapped, isolated in the middle of nowhere. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would leave. I would pack up and drive out, no matter how long it took. But when I went outside to load my car, I saw something that froze me in place. The dirt path leading up to the cabin was covered in fresh, deep footprints. Large, heavy prints that didn't belong to any animal I knew. The prints were spaced wide apart, as if whoever or whatever had left them was moving quickly, almost running. And they led right up to the cabin door. I didn't want to look inside, but I had to. I opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped inside. The fire was still burning low in the fireplace, and the place was as I had left it. But something was different. The furniture had been moved slightly, and there was a faint smell in the air, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until I looked down that I realized what it was. A pile of dirt on the floor, right in the center of the room. Couldn't breathe. I felt lightheaded, dizzy, my vision narrowing. The dirt looked fresh, like someone had just brought it in from outside. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I knew there was no way I had done that. I grabbed my things in a panic, not even bothering to lock the door as I ran outside. I was halfway to my car when I heard something. A voice, not a shout or a cry, but a low, steady murmur, like someone was speaking to me. It was coming from the woods, from the direction of the trail. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I drove as fast as I could, all the way back to the nearest town, my heart pounding in my ears the entire way. I didn't stop for gas, didn't check my rearview mirror. I just wanted to get away from that cabin, away from whatever had been following me. When I finally got to a gas station, I pulled over, trembling, and tried to collect myself. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. They would think I was crazy, but I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting for me to leave that cabin. I never went back. And as for the cabin, I heard later from a local in town that it had been abandoned for years. The family that owned it had left suddenly, without explanation, and no one had lived there since. The woods, they said, had a way of making people feel like they weren't alone. And some of them, they whispered, never left. But I didn't need anyone to tell me that. I knew what I'd experienced, and I knew I was lucky to have made it out of there alive. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, just a weekend getaway to unwind, get away from the noise of the city. I was in my late 20s, a software developer working remotely. I'd heard about this cabin from a friend who had rented it a few years ago, and it seemed perfect. Tucked deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, it promised quiet solitude. I wasn't a fan of the usual vacation spots, overcrowded beaches, noisy bars, or bustling tourist attractions. This place sounded perfect. Just a small wooden cabin with a wood stove, a little porch, and a surrounding forest. The drive there was long, too long. The GPS didn't do a good job of tracking the winding dirt roads leading to the cabin. I passed the last signs of civilization a while ago, and now it was just me, the trees, and a feeling of isolation settling in. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees when I finally pulled into the gravel driveway. The place looked exactly like the pictures. Rustic, charming, and peaceful. There was something oddly calming about it, but I also couldn't shake off a small feeling of discomfort, something in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't explain. The air was fresh, crisp, like the forest was inhaling and exhaling all around me. I grabbed my bags from the car and started up the creaky steps leading to the porch. The cabin wasn't big, just one bedroom, a living room, a small kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. perfect place to be alone for a weekend. I had no reason to feel uneasy. The place was serene, and I should have felt at ease. But as I stepped inside and looked around, something about it just felt off. The furniture was old, well-worn, but not in the cozy way you expect a cabin to be. The smell of pine and wood was thick, but so was something else. Something faintly musty, like the cabin hadn't been aired out in a long time. I dismissed it as nothing. Maybe I was just tired from the drive. I set my things down, started a fire in the wood stove, and made myself dinner. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, and soon I was sitting in the armchair, looking out the small window at the dark forest. The wind howled outside, making the trees bend and sway. I felt so far removed from everything: work, people, noise. As night fell, the silence grew deeper. There were no animals, no rustling in the woods. Nothing, just the fire and the wind. I tried to relax, but that feeling, that unease, wouldn't go away. It was almost as if the cabin was watching me, the walls closing in little by little. I decided to go to bed early. After a long, quiet night, maybe I'd feel better in the morning. The bed was small but comfortable. The sheets were fresh, and the blankets heavy, making it easy to fall asleep. Yet, despite my exhaustion, I tossed and turned. I couldn't explain it, but something about the dark seemed more intense here. I was used to being alone, but here it felt different. I woke up around midnight. The wind had picked up, and the trees were creaking and groaning outside, like they were trying to speak to me. The fire had died down, and the only light came from the moon streaming through the small window. I thought about getting up to throw another log on the fire, but I didn't. It was like my body was telling me to stay still, not to move. Then I heard it, a soft thud. It wasn't from inside the cabin, but outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something, but then it came again, a dull thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I stayed still, straining to listen. Another thud, closer this time, and then another even closer. My heart started racing. Maybe it was just the wind pushing branches around. Or maybe it was an animal, I told myself. But then the thought came to me, the one I hadn't wanted to entertain. What if it was someone out there? I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound didn't stop. I slid out of bed quietly, grabbed a flashlight from my bag, and crept to the window. There was nothing in sight, just the forest, black and still. But that didn't stop the feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. I went back to bed, covering myself with the blankets, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, and I kept hearing those thuds in my head. I finally decided to get up and check the cabin just to be sure. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly made my way through the dark cabin. The wooden floorboards creaked under my feet as I checked every room. Bedroom, living room, kitchen, bathroom. Everything seemed fine. Nothing was out of place. No signs of anyone having been inside. The thuds had stopped. I turned off the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just imagined it. After all, I hadn't been in a place like this in a while, and maybe the quiet was starting to get to me. I climbed back into bed and tried to fall asleep, but the unease lingered. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized something had changed. The back door was slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it the night before. There was no way I would have left it open. The latch clicked shut when I left the cabin the day before, and I hadn't gone back out until now. But there it was, wide open. The cold morning air drifted in from outside. I checked the lock. It wasn't broken, but it felt off, as though someone had gently nudged it open from the outside. I immediately closed the door, locked it, and checked the other windows. Everything seemed intact, but that creeping feeling, the unease, was back in full force. I spent the rest of the day trying to calm myself down. I went for a hike around the cabin, hoping the fresh air and sunlight would clear my head. The woods were beautiful, the ground soft beneath my boots, and the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. But the thought of someone being out there, watching me, lingered at the back of my mind. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, people came up here to escape, right? It wasn't out of the ordinary to find an open door or hear strange noises in a place so far removed from the world. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was exhausted. The hike hadn't helped much, but it gave me something to focus on. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something different. The porch light was on. I was sure I hadn't turned it on before I left. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs. Someone had been here. I felt my throat tighten as I walked up to the door. I tried the handle. It was locked, but that didn't reassure me. Whoever had been here knew I was alone. They were watching me. I stepped inside, checked the cabin thoroughly, just like I did the night before. No sign of anyone. Nothing disturbed. That night, I locked the doors, checked the windows, and set the chairs in front of them as if to create some barrier, just in case. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The noises had come again, only this time, they weren't just distant thuds. It was a scraping sound, like something was being dragged along the ground, slow and deliberate. It started after midnight and didn't stop. My heart was in my throat. I grabbed the flashlight, a knife from the kitchen for some kind of protection, and went outside, even though every instinct screamed at me not to. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the ground, everything. The scraping stopped. I felt ridiculous standing there, holding a knife in the middle of the forest all alone. There was no one, nothing. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. The ground had been disturbed, like someone had recently walked over it, and not far from the porch, something was sticking out of the dirt. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I brushed away the dirt. It was a shovel, and next to it, the unmistakable mark of a large, freshly dug hole. I stood up, heart pounding, and ran back inside. I locked all the doors again, turned out the lights, and sat in the dark, listening. Nothing happened after that. The scraping stopped, and the rest of the night passed without incident. In the morning, the sun rose, and the cabin felt a little less ominous. I packed my bags, checked everything one last time, and left without a word, leaving that forest behind. The experience stayed with me. I never went back to that cabin. I still don't know who had been out there, but I know one thing. Some places, no matter how beautiful or peaceful they seem, are meant to stay untouched. And I wasn't meant to be there, not really. The unease? I'll never shake it off completely. I never should have agreed to go. That thought sat heavy in my chest the whole drive up, but I pushed it down. It was just a cabin, just a weekend, just some time away from the city. I kept telling myself that as the miles stretched on, as the trees grew taller, thicker, swallowing the road. The deeper we got, the more uneasy I felt. But I said nothing. The plan was simple. A few days in a rented cabin up in the woods of Montana. No cell service, no internet. Just me and my brother, Mark. He had always been the outdoorsy one, the kind of guy who loved hiking, fishing, camping. I wasn't. I liked my apartment, my routine, my comforts. But Mark had insisted, said I needed to get away from the noise. I should have trusted my gut. The road to the cabin was barely a road at all. Just dirt and gravel, potholes deep enough to snap an axle. The trees on either side leaned in, thick and dark. Felt like we were being swallowed whole. By the time we pulled up, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, a squat wooden structure with a wraparound porch and a single light flickering above the door. It was isolated. No neighbors, no signs of life, just us and the forest. Inside, it was what you'd expect: basic furniture, a fireplace, a tiny kitchen. No TV, no landline, just a radio sitting on a dusty shelf, next to a few worn books. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and something else. Something musty, like damp earth. I told myself it was just the age of the place. The first night was quiet, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, feeling like I'd heard something just beyond the cabin walls. A branch snapping, leaves crunching. But when I looked outside, there was nothing, just darkness pressing against the windows. Morning came slow, gray light filtering through the trees. Mark was already up, making coffee. He wanted to hike. I didn't, but I went anyway. The trail was narrow, winding up through the trees, the silence broken only by the occasional bird or rustle of wind. The deeper we went, the more wrong it felt. The trees were too still, the air too thick. I kept feeling like we were being watched. About an hour in, we found something. A clearing, but not just any clearing, it looked unnatural. The trees here had been cut, not fallen. A rough circle of stumps, like someone had carved out a space for something. In the center, there was an old fire pit, long cold, surrounded by bones. Small ones, animals, I told myself. Had to be. Mark laughed it off, said hunters probably used it. But I saw something in his face. He didn't believe that either. We didn't stay long. The whole way back, I felt eyes on me. That night, the unease sat heavy in my chest. Every sound outside made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, just animals. But then, around midnight, I heard something different. Footsteps. Not animal. Not some deer or raccoon. Heavy. Slow. Close. I held my breath, heart hammering. The steps stopped just outside the window. I didn't move. Didn't even blink. And then, nothing. Silence. I told myself I imagined it. That I was letting my nerves get to me. The next morning, Mark was already up again. I didn't mention what I heard. Didn't want to sound paranoid. He wanted to fish at the lake about a mile from the cabin. I stayed behind. I needed space. Needed to shake this feeling. I spent the morning reading, trying to ignore the creeping unease. Around noon, I heard something outside. Not footsteps this time. A rustling. Slow, deliberate. I looked out the window and froze. There was a man standing just beyond the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the branches, watching the cabin. My mouth went dry. He was far enough that I couldn't make out his face, but I knew he was looking at me. Every instinct screamed to lock the doors, to grab something, anything, to defend myself. But before I could move, he turned and walked back into the woods. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker who had wandered too close. But deep down, I knew better. I waited for Mark. When he finally got back, I told him. He didn't believe me, said I was letting my imagination run wild. But I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't sleep easy that night either. The third day, I wanted to leave. Mark didn't, said we were overreacting. But I noticed how he kept the hatchet close, how his eyes flicked to the windows more often. Something wasn't right. That night, we heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. Then a knock, soft, just once. Then silence. Neither of us moved. My breath felt trapped in my throat. Mark gripped the hatchet, his knuckles white. Another knock, still soft, almost polite. And then the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle, didn't jerk. Just a slow, steady twist. It was locked. Thank God, it was locked. We sat in silence, barely breathing. The doorknob stopped. No footsteps, no retreating sounds, just silence. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, we were packed. Mark didn't argue anymore. We got in the truck, hearts pounding, and drove. As we pulled away, I looked back at the cabin. And that's when I saw it. The man, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. He didn't move, didn't chase, just stood there, his head tilting slightly, like he was memorizing our faces. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know how long he had been watching, but I know this: I will never go back, and I will never ignore my gut again. I remember the day I arrived at the cabin like it just happened. It was late October, 1996. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a sky smeared with gray. The drive had been long, nearly 6 hours through winding back roads, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, my back ached from sitting too long. I had rented the place for a week, wanting nothing but solitude. Life in the city had become overwhelming. Work had drained me to the bone, and I needed a break. This cabin, deep in the Colorado wilderness, seemed perfect. Isolated, no neighbors for miles, and according to the listing, equipped with everything I needed to survive a week off the grid. As soon as I stepped out of my truck, the cold air cut through my jacket. The trees surrounded the clearing like silent watchers, and the only sound was the soft crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, made of thick logs darkened with age. A stone chimney rose from the side, and a small porch wrapped around the front. It looked exactly like the photos, except for one thing. The door was slightly open. I stopped in my tracks. I was sure I had double-checked the listing. The owner had assured me it would be locked, the keys left under a loose stone beside the steps. But now the door stood open just a crack, dark and silent. I debated for a moment. Maybe the wind had done it. Maybe the last guest had forgotten to close it all the way. I reached into the truck, grabbed the tire iron from under my seat, and walked toward the cabin slowly. Pushing the door open, I peered inside. The main room was dim, only lit by the weak afternoon light filtering through the windows. A fireplace sat against the far wall, a couch and a small wooden table in the center. To the right, a tiny kitchen with an old fridge and stove. A narrow hallway led to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything was neat. Nothing looked out of place. I stepped inside and set my bag down by the door. The air smelled stale like wood and dust. My eyes darted around, looking for anything that seemed off, but everything looked normal. Still, the open door unsettled me. I checked the bedroom. The bed was made, the sheets crisp and undisturbed. The bathroom was empty. I even checked the closets, the pantry, under the bed. Nothing. Deciding I was being paranoid, I went back to my truck, grabbed my supplies, and locked the door behind me. The first thing I did was start a fire in the fireplace, wanting to warm up the place. The wood caught quickly, filling the cabin with a crackling warmth. I opened a beer and sat back on the couch, trying to shake the lingering unease. Night fell fast. Out here, away from city lights, the darkness was thick. The only light came from the fire and the dim glow of the lantern I had placed on the table. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, and decided to turn in early. I locked the front door, double-checking it this time, and crawled into bed. I woke sometime in the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, leaving only faint embers. The room was cold. Then I heard it, a soft creak. My breath caught. It had come from the main room. I lay still, listening. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. I told myself it was just the cabin settling, the old wood shifting in the cold. But then I heard another sound, a faint rustling, like fabric moving against fabric. Someone was in the cabin. My mind raced. I had locked the door. No windows were open. My truck was still outside, which meant whoever was in here had either been hiding inside before I arrived, or had a way in I didn't know about. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet freezing against the wooden floor. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from my bag, gripping it tight. If I had to use it as a weapon, I would. I took a slow step toward the hallway, pausing to listen. The rustling had stopped. The only sound was the wind outside, rattling the windows. But I knew I wasn't alone. Peeking into the main room, I saw nothing at first. The couch, the table, the fireplace, everything looked normal. Then my eyes landed on the door. It was open again. Not just a crack this time. Wide open, yawning into the dark woods beyond. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and dead leaves. I felt my stomach drop. My mind screamed to move, to do something, but I stood frozen. Then, something shifted in the darkness outside. A figure, just beyond the porch, barely visible in the weak moonlight. I could see the outline of a person standing still, watching. Couldn't breathe. My body locked up, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. My instincts screamed at me to run. But where? My truck was outside, past them. The cabin was small, no place to hide. Then, as if they could hear my thoughts, the figure took a step forward. That broke the spell. I lunged for the door and slammed it shut, locking it, bolting it, shoving the table against it for good measure. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped the flashlight. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the door. I waited. Minutes stretched, feeling like hours. Nothing. No footsteps. No knocking. Just silence. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the farthest corner of the room, watching the door. When the first light of dawn crept in, I dared to move. The figure was gone. The woods were still and empty. No footprints in the dirt. No signs of anyone. But the open door, the rustling, it had been real. I didn't waste time. I packed my things, threw them into my truck, and left without looking back. I never told the owner, never asked if anyone had died there, if anyone else had experienced something similar. I didn't want to know, and I sure as hell never went back. It was the fall of 1998. I was 27 years old and had just gotten out of a long, exhausting relationship. I needed space, time to think, and maybe even the chance to feel like myself again. My friend Mark suggested his family's old cabin up in the woods of northern Minnesota, about a 3-hour drive from where I lived in Duluth. He said it was isolated, quiet, perfect for clearing my head. The drive up was uneventful. A 2-lane highway turned into a winding gravel road, which eventually became a narrow, rutted dirt path. The trees pressed in on both sides, a thick wall of red, orange, and yellow. I lost cell service about halfway there, but I wasn't worried. I had a map and a flashlight, and the weather was crisp but clear. I figured I'd spend a week in solitude, hiking, reading, and maybe doing some writing. A break from everything. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 40s by Mark's grandfather. It was sturdy but worn, with dark wood siding and a sagging porch. A single chimney rose from the roof. There was a small clearing around it, but beyond that, nothing but forest. It sat near a lake, but not the kind of lake people vacationed at. This was dark, still water, surrounded by thick trees and reeds. No docks, no houses, no boats. Just a lake that looked black no matter how bright the sun shined. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly damp. There was no electricity, just a propane stove, an old iron wood-burning stove for heat, and kerosene lanterns. I had brought plenty of supplies. Canned food, bottled water, a hunting knife, just in case, and a small battery-powered radio. There was no indoor plumbing, just an outhouse about 20 yards from the back door. The first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, drinking a beer and listening to the wind rustle through the trees. The stars above were impossibly bright, the kind you don't see in the city. I went to bed early, wrapped in a thick blanket, and let the silence lull me to sleep. I woke up sometime in the night to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer stepping through the underbrush. But then I heard it again, a deliberate crunch, a footstep, not an animal, something heavier. I lay there, heart pounding, holding my breath. The sound came again, slow, measured steps circling the cabin. My mind went through every possibility. A bear? A lost hiker? But why would someone be out here in the middle of the night with no light, no voice calling for help? I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but the glass reflected too much for me to see clearly outside. The footsteps stopped. I stayed awake for hours, listening. The wind picked up, and eventually, I convinced myself it was just a tree branch scraping against the roof, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, checking for any signs that someone had been there. I saw nothing. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and there were no footprints, at least none that I could make out. I shook it off and went about my day, hiking a few miles into the woods, gathering firewood, and trying to enjoy my time alone. That night, the footsteps came back. I was sitting inside reading by lantern light when I heard them again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was moving outside. Slow, steady steps, circling the cabin just like the night before. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight and crept toward the window. My breath felt loud in the quiet. I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it outside. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I turned off the light and backed away from the window. Then I heard it right outside the front door. I don't know how long I stood there, gripping the knife, barely breathing. But after a while, the sound of footsteps faded into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the knife next to me, staring at the door until dawn. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I packed up my things as fast as I could, throwing everything into my bag. When I stepped outside to load up my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not hiking shoes. Bare feet. Large, misshapen prints, as if someone had been walking barefoot through the forest. They led from the tree line to my cabin and then back again. I locked the cabin behind me and got in my car. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic set in. I checked under the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. I had no idea what was wrong. I only knew I was stuck, miles from anyone, with no way to call for help. I had two options: stay in the cabin and hope that whatever was out there wouldn't come back, or walk the miles back to the main road and hope someone drove by. I chose to walk. I packed as lightly as I could, bringing water, my flashlight, my knife, and the small revolver Mark had left in the cabin years ago, just in case. I stuck to the road, walking as fast as I could without running. The woods felt different now, too quiet, like they were waiting for something. I had been walking for maybe an hour when I heard it. Footsteps, not behind me, beside me. Something was moving through the trees, keeping pace with me. I didn't turn my head. I didn't want to see it. I just kept walking, forcing myself not to panic. The footsteps followed me for miles. It wasn't until I saw the break in the trees up ahead, the main road, that I finally let myself run. I sprinted the last stretch, bursting out onto the asphalt, breathless and shaking. There was no one there, no cars, no cabins, just empty road. I waited. An hour passed, then another. Finally, a truck appeared in the distance. I waved it down, nearly throwing myself into the road. The driver, an older man, let me in without question. I didn't tell him everything, just that my car had broken down at a cabin deep in the woods and that I needed to get back to town. I never went back for the car. Mark sent someone to tow it a week later. The mechanic said the engine had been tampered with, wires cut clean through. Whoever had been out there with me had made sure I couldn't leave. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night, and I don't want to. The cabin was supposed to be a weekend escape. Nothing fancy, nothing too far from the city, just a place to clear my head. I had rented it off a listing online, promising solitude and peace, away from the noise of the everyday grind. The cabin sat in a small, remote area on the edge of the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town. Perfect, I thought. I hadn't been up there in ages. After years of living in crowded city apartments, I was craving silence. Maybe the woods would offer the kind of isolation I needed. I drove up alone. The drive was long, and by the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, it was nearing dusk. The air had a crisp bite to it, autumn's chill seeping in. The road itself wasn't well maintained, filled with potholes and uneven ground. The car jolted with each bump, the tires crunching on the gravel, as I twisted the steering wheel to avoid large rocks. The sun was nearly gone, casting long shadows through the thick trees that flanked the road. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a clearing in the woods, its small, wooden frame almost blending in with the darkening landscape. It looked rustic, maybe even a little dilapidated, nothing like the pristine, modern places you see in brochures. The dark windows made it look abandoned, as if no one had lived there in years. But according to the online description, it was cozy and fully equipped. I parked in front of the cabin and stepped out, the cold air instantly biting at my face. The trees around the clearing were tall and dense, with no sign of other cabins or people nearby. It was just me, the cabin, and the woods. The key was hidden in the usual spot, a small lockbox by the door. I found it easily, slid it out, and unlocked the door. Inside, The cabin smelled of dust, pine, and something a little musty. The furniture was basic: an old couch, a small coffee table, a stone fireplace with a pile of firewood beside it. The kitchen was simple: a stove, a refrigerator, a small dining table with 2 chairs. The place wasn't luxurious, but it felt comfortable enough for one person. It had that lived-in feel, though no one had been there recently. I spent the next few hours getting settled. The sun had fully set by the time I started a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames providing the only light in the room. The silence in the cabin was thick, and it made my mind wander. The only sounds were the occasional snap of wood from the fire and the soft rustling of leaves outside, pushed by the wind. Around 9 p.m. I heard it, a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, distinct, a knock, quiet but clear. I paused. The sound didn't come from the direction of the door, but deeper, from the back of the cabin, near the windows that looked out into the woods. It was a hollow sound, almost like something or someone was tapping on the wooden walls of the cabin. I tried to brush it off. Maybe an animal? Maybe the cabin settling, an old house making noises in the night. I walked over to the window, peered out into the dark, but saw nothing, just the blackness of the woods stretching out into the distance. I couldn't make out any shapes, no shadows moving. No one was there. I returned to the couch and pulled a blanket around me, trying to focus on the warmth from the fire. But the sound of the tapping kept repeating, soft but steady, like a rhythmic knocking. It made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like something natural, not like the wind or animals. It sounded deliberate. I decided to check outside. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air hit me again, sharper now, as I swept the beam of the flashlight over the surroundings. The woods were eerily still, no movement except for the occasional swaying of branches. There was nothing. I checked around the cabin, circling it slowly. The woods were silent. The only sounds were my own breath and the occasional crackle from the fire inside. I found nothing. No one, no animals, no sign of anything unusual. Relieved but still uneasy, I returned inside. The tapping had stopped for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the door behind me, double-checked the windows, and went back to the couch. But sleep didn't come easily. The stillness of the night pressed down on me, making every creak and groan of the cabin seem louder than it was. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash from the kitchen. My body went stiff, and my heart hammered in my chest. I froze, listening. Silence. I got up slowly, creeping toward the kitchen. My flashlight was still in my hand, its beam shaking slightly in the dark. The kitchen appeared undisturbed at first, but as I stepped closer, I saw it. A chair had tipped over, its legs splayed out against the floor. I hadn't left the chair like that. In fact, I hadn't touched it at all. I felt a surge of panic. I definitely locked the door and windows, and I hadn't heard anyone enter. No one could have gotten in without me noticing. I checked the back door. It was still locked. The windows were secure. My mind raced. What was going on? Could it have been the wind again? I thought of the tapping, the knocking from earlier, but that didn't make sense. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was something about this place, something off that I couldn't explain. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the fire, listening to every little sound. The wind howled outside, branches scraping against the windows like fingers trying to get in. The tapping returned, but now it wasn't just on the back walls, it was coming from the roof. A slow, deliberate pattern. I jumped at every noise, my senses on edge. The next morning, the sun rose weakly through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. It felt like a relief to see daylight again, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. I made myself breakfast and sat down to eat, my hands trembling slightly. I decided to pack up early and leave. The sense of unease hadn't left me, and I didn't want to spend another night in that cabin. But as I stepped outside to load up the car, something caught my eye. A set of footprints in the dirt near the back porch. The tracks were fresh, leading away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. I loaded up the car quickly, my hands shaking as I tossed my bags in. I didn't bother checking the cabin again. I just wanted to get out. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin was still there, standing alone in the woods, its dark windows reflecting the early morning light. The silence was deafening, but it felt different now. Not peaceful, but heavy, as if something had shifted while I wasn't looking. I didn't know who or what had been there that night, and I didn't want to know. But I learned something that weekend. Silence can be unsettling, especially when you realize you're not truly alone. And that's why I don't go back to the woods anymore. Not for peace, not for quiet, because sometimes silence isn't comforting. It's the loudest thing of all. It was late October, the kind of season where the wind howls a little too loudly and the nights come too soon. I had rented the cabin to get away for a while. No distractions, no work, just a few quiet days to clear my head. I'd found the place online in some forgotten corner of the internet. The cabin, tucked deep in the hills of upstate New York, was simple. One room, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft with a bed. The surrounding woods were thick with trees, their branches twisted, leafless skeletons shaking in the wind. It wasn't much, but that was exactly what I wanted. I arrived at dusk, the sun sinking low, casting long shadows on the cracked dirt road that led to the cabin. The last stretch of road was barely passable, with deep ruts that rattled the car's suspension, but it added to the isolation. As I pulled up to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The place looked well-maintained. Sure, but there was something off, like it had been abandoned for a while and someone had recently cleaned it up. It didn't make sense, but I shrugged it off. The first night was peaceful. Too peaceful, in fact. The only sounds were the wind and the occasional rustle of something in the woods. I tried to relax, but the silence seemed unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I'd been too used to the constant hum of city life, to the noise, the people. This place felt empty. I didn't sleep much that first night. There was no reason for it, I just couldn't. My mind kept circling back to the strangest details. The faint creaks of the wooden beams, the small window above the bed that let in the moonlight, the odd shape of the trees outside the cabin, like twisted arms reaching toward me. The next morning, I tried to push it all aside. I made coffee on the stove and took a walk around the property. The woods were thick, dense enough that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor. I figured I'd head down to the nearby creek, which the cabin's listing had mentioned. It wasn't far, maybe a half-mile hike. As I made my way through the trees, I noticed something strange. There were no animals. Not a single bird, no squirrels, not even insects. The stillness was unnerving. By the time I reached the creek, my unease had grown. The water ran clear, though it wasn't deep, just a steady trickle between rocks. I crouched down to touch it, but the air felt colder here, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the time it took me to walk the short distance. I stood up and rubbed my arms, a shiver running down my spine, despite the mild autumn weather. I didn't linger, felt wrong. I made my way back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I arrived, I was relieved to see that everything seemed normal. No one had been around. I locked the door behind me and set about preparing lunch. The day went by in a blur. I couldn't focus. There was something nagging at the back of my mind, something that wouldn't let me be. I tried to read, tried to watch the trees sway through the window, but I kept hearing things. Faint thuds from upstairs, the faintest scuffling of footsteps, but whenever I'd look, nothing would be there. I decided to stay inside that night. The air outside felt too cold, and the thought of walking through the dark woods alone made me uneasy. I cooked a simple dinner, settled by the fire, and tried to distract myself with the low crackle of the flames. But I could barely focus on the warmth. I was hyper-aware of every sound around me. The wind tapping at the windows, the creaks in the walls, the occasional pop of the fire. At around midnight, the quiet was interrupted. A loud bang echoed from upstairs, sharp, like a heavy object had fallen over. My heart leaped into my throat. I had checked the place earlier, made sure the loft door was locked. But now I wasn't so sure. My pulse quickened, and I held my breath, listening. Nothing. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It felt heavier. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but my instincts told me otherwise. I had to check. I couldn't just sit there and let it fester. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way up the stairs to the loft. The air felt colder as I ascended, the steps creaking beneath my weight. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything. The loft was empty, as it had been when I first arrived. The bed was made, the window opened slightly to let in the fresh night air. And then I saw it. The door to the attic, which I hadn't noticed before, was ajar. I could see the faint outline of stairs leading up into the darkness. I hadn't opened it, nor had I noticed it when I first arrived. I told myself it was probably just an old storage space, nothing to worry about. But the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating, and I couldn't help but step closer. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath shallow. I didn't want to look, didn't want to go up there, but something inside me pushed me forward. I climbed the stairs. The attic was small, the beams low and crisscrossed above me. The air smelled stale like dust and old wood. I shined the flashlight around, half expecting to see something lurking in the corners, but there was nothing. Just old trunks, a few boxes stacked haphazardly in one corner, and something else. A chair. It was old, like the kind you'd see in an antique store, with carved wooden arms and a worn cushion. But it was out of place, sitting there in the center of the room, facing the wall. I couldn't understand why it was there or who would have put it there. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed it. The scratches on the floor. They were long, deep grooves, like something had been dragged across the wood. And the worst part? They led right up to the chair. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. Something wasn't right, something deep inside the walls of this place. But as I turned to leave, the door to the attic slammed shut. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The noise was deafening, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I stood there, paralyzed, the flashlight shaking in my hands. There was no wind, no reason for the door to slam. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I tried to turn the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic gripped me. I slammed my shoulder against the door, but it wouldn't give. I was trapped. Suddenly, the handle rattled, and the door creaked open, not by my own doing. I stumbled backward, and the flashlight fell from my hands, casting eerie shadows against the walls. I was out of the attic in a heartbeat, scrambling down the stairs, not caring about the noise I made. I reached the main floor, my heart thudding in my chest. But when I turned to lock the door, the cabin felt different, more oppressive, like something heavy was hanging in the air. I went to the window. The moon was bright, almost too bright, casting strange shadows on the ground outside. But as I stared into the woods, something moved, just a flicker, barely visible. But there, it was just beyond the tree line, almost like a shadow among shadows. I wasn't going to stay another minute. I packed my things in a frantic rush, tossing everything into my bag, my hands shaking so badly that I could hardly zip it closed. I didn't care about the mess, didn't care about anything except getting away. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door. The drive back to town was long, but I didn't care. I didn't look back, not once. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. It wasn't supposed to be anything like this. A quiet weekend away, a break from everything, was all I wanted. But sometimes, when you're out there, alone with your thoughts, the silence starts to feel too loud. It was the fall of 2022, just before the cold sets in, and the last bit of warmth was lingering in the air. I needed time away, time to think. Work had been relentless, and my personal life, well, it was a mess. I rented a cabin in the mountains, somewhere far enough from everything to clear my head, but close enough that I could get back if I needed to. The place was listed online as rustic, with just enough amenities to make it comfortable, but not much more. A small wood stove for heat, a few old wooden chairs, and an overgrown garden outside that looked like no one had tended to it in years. I drove up there alone. My only company was the hum of the car's engine and the occasional crunch of tires on gravel as I drove deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, an almost claustrophobic feeling, even in daylight. There was a strange quiet to it, not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something heavy, like the kind of silence you hear in a place where things aren't right. I thought it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. The cabin was more isolated than I had expected. The path leading up to it was barely visible, with branches hanging low, scraping the sides of my car. The last stretch to the cabin was uphill, and I had to park a little farther down and walk the rest of the way. The air was cool, and the smell of damp earth mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke. There was something raw about it, like the land hadn't been disturbed in a long time. When I finally arrived, I was struck by how still everything was. The cabin stood there, nestled between towering trees, covered in moss, with no sound of animals or birds around. Just this eerie, unnatural quiet. I unpacked quickly, not wanting to be outside longer than necessary. The key was under the porch, hidden in a metal box with a combination lock, an old-fashioned touch. Once inside, I found the place to be a bit more charming than the listing had let on. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet, and the air smelled of pine and old books. It was cozy in a way, though something about it still felt off. I set my things down in the small living room and lit the stove. There was a large window at the back of the cabin, looking out into the dense woods, and it was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. The trees stood like dark sentinels, unmoving, watching. The light from the stove flickered across the room, casting long shadows. The house felt oddly empty, even though I was there alone. It was as though it had been waiting for someone, but not necessarily welcoming them. The first night went by without incident. I spent it reading and relaxing, letting the warmth of the stove comfort me. There was no phone service and no Wi-Fi, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me, a book, and the silence. But when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything I could explain. No sounds, no movements, but the sensation of being watched lingered. I woke up early the next morning to find the sky overcast. The wind had picked up, and it was starting to rain hard. A storm was rolling in, and I figured I was stuck there for at least the next day, maybe two. I didn't mind. It gave me more time to think. I spent the day exploring around the cabin. The property was surrounded by woods, with a few overgrown trails leading off in different directions. I took one of them, trying to clear my head, but the more I walked, the more uneasy I felt. It was the trees, they were just so thick, the trunks so close together. Felt like they were closing in on me. I kept hearing things, footsteps behind me, branches snapping when no one was near. But when I turned around, there was nothing. It was stupid, I know, but I was beginning to feel like I wasn't alone out there. Around midday, the rain picked up, and I decided to head back to the cabin. The trail was harder to follow now, the ground wet and slippery, but I eventually made it back. I locked the door behind me as I entered, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to. The cabin still had that same strange atmosphere, but I ignored it, trying to focus on something normal. As night fell, the storm outside grew fiercer. The wind howled, and the rain slapped the windows. I could hear it, the drumming of the rain, the branches scratching against the roof like fingers. And then, I heard it, the sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin. Not the wind, not the trees, but something else. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. It sounded like fingernails dragging across the wood. I stood frozen, staring at the door, heart pounding. The scraping stopped. Silence followed. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing came after. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or not, but I decided to stay close to the stove, reading until I fell asleep. The next day, I woke up to find that the weather hadn't cleared. The rain was relentless, and the air was damp and cold. I didn't want to venture far outside, so I spent the morning indoors. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something strange. Objects around the cabin were out of place. A chair that I had left pushed against the table was now closer to the door. A mug was no longer on the counter. And then, the worst part, the door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it the night before. I checked the place thoroughly, making sure no windows were broken or anything had been disturbed, but everything seemed normal. Yet that feeling of being watched, of not being alone, intensified. I couldn't shake it, and it wasn't just in the house anymore. It was in the woods too. As the evening set in, I decided to go for a walk around the cabin, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The wind had died down, and the rain had turned into a light drizzle. I walked slowly, trying to make sense of the unease crawling under my skin. The trees around me felt wrong. There was an odd heaviness to the air, and the woods were so quiet that even the smallest noise felt too loud. Then, as I was turning to head back to the cabin, I saw it. Just a glimpse, but enough to make my blood run cold. A figure, barely visible between the trees. It was standing still, watching me. I froze, staring at it, heart hammering in my chest. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me, as if it was studying me from the darkness. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my mind racing. I burst inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew I didn't want to find out. That night, I hardly slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, had me on edge. I kept hearing things outside, footsteps, the soft rustling of the trees. And then, I heard it again, the scraping sound. But this time, it was different. It wasn't on the side of the cabin. It was on the roof. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept to the window, shining it out toward the roof. Nothing, but I could still hear the scraping. It was coming from the other side now, and I could see faint marks appearing on the roof. Deep, jagged grooves being made as something or someone dragged itself along the wood. I was done. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my things, hurriedly packed a bag, and bolted for the door. I didn't care about the rain or the storm anymore. I had to leave. As I made my way down the hill toward my car, I looked back one last time at the cabin, and there, in one of the windows, I saw it. The figure from the trees, standing inside the cabin, watching me. I didn't look back again. I made it to the car, slammed the door shut, and drove away, my heart still racing. The storm was picking up, but I didn't care. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. And as I drove, the fear slowly began to subside. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, in the woods, was still watching me, waiting for the next person who dared to step foot in that cabin. I never went back, and I never will. I remember the exact moment I pulled off the main road and onto the dirt path leading deep into the woods. The rental cabin was miles away from the nearest town, just how I wanted it. I needed solitude, time to clear my head. Life back home had become too much. The endless cycle of work, stress, and sleepless nights. I thought maybe a few weeks in the wilderness would help. The cabin sat in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't the cozy, storybook kind. It was a simple wooden structure, aged and weathered, with a wraparound porch and a single chimney sticking out the top. It had been built decades ago, probably as a hunting retreat. The photos online had made it seem more inviting, but standing in front of it, I felt something uneasy settle in my chest. The trees loomed tall and close, their bare branches scraping against the sky like claws. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The living room was sparsely furnished. A single couch, an old wooden table, and a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. A hallway led to a small bedroom with a single bed and a rickety dresser. The kitchen was outdated but functional, with a rusted sink and a fridge that hummed too loudly. The bathroom, tucked in the back, had a mirror that was cracked at the corner. Everything felt abandoned, forgotten. I told myself it was fine. It was exactly what I needed. I unpacked my bags, placed my groceries in the fridge, and lit a fire in the fireplace. The warmth made the space feel slightly more inviting, but the silence pressed against me. There were no sounds of passing cars, no hum of distant city life, just the wind outside, rustling through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I slept lightly, waking up at every creak of the wooden floorboards. The second night, I noticed something strange. I had locked the front door before going to bed, but when I woke up in the morning, it was slightly open, just an inch or two, enough to make my stomach drop. Maybe I hadn't shut it properly. Maybe the wind had nudged it open. I checked the lock, it was old but functional. I shrugged it off and made breakfast. But that feeling, the one that had settled in my chest when I first arrived, deepened. The next few days were a blur of routine. I spent time outside, hiking through the woods, chopping firewood, reading on the porch. But every night I made sure to lock the doors and windows. And every morning the door was open again, just a crack, just enough to make me question myself. By the end of the first week, I was convinced someone was coming into the cabin at night. The thought burrowed into my mind, twisting my stomach into knots. I started checking for signs, footprints in the dirt outside, disturbed leaves, anything. But I found nothing, just the open door, taunting me each morning. Then came the sound. It started on the 8th night, a soft creaking from the kitchen. I lay in bed, frozen. The wind had died down hours ago, and the silence outside was heavy. I listened, barely breathing. The creak came again, followed by a faint shuffle, like someone moving slowly, carefully. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and sat up. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I clicked the flashlight on and aimed it at the doorway. The cabin was small. There wasn't anywhere for someone to hide. I forced myself to get up, stepping slowly toward the kitchen. Nothing. The door was locked, just as I had left it. The windows were shut. I stood there for a long time, flashlight trembling in my grip. Maybe the old wood was just settling. Maybe I was letting paranoia get the best of me. I went back to bed but barely slept. Every sound became magnified in the silence. Every shift in the air sent a spike of fear down my spine. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. The salt shaker, which had been on the counter the night before, was now on the kitchen table. A small change, barely noticeable, but I knew I hadn't moved it. Someone had been inside. That night, I didn't go to sleep. I sat in the living room with a knife in my hand, the fireplace casting flickering shadows against the walls. The hours dragged on, and then, just past midnight, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, gripping the knife tighter. The door didn't open, but the knob twisted again, as if someone was testing it. I stood, heart hammering, and stepped toward the door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the lock. I yanked it open, flashlight beaming into the night. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees stood still, barely moving in the light breeze. But I felt it, the undeniable presence of someone watching. I slammed the door shut and locked it again. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was watching, waiting. At first light, I packed my bags, threw everything into my car, and didn't look back. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, silent and unassuming, as if nothing had ever happened, as if it hadn't tried to swallow me whole. I never found out who it was. Maybe a drifter, maybe a local who didn't want me there, maybe something worse. But I didn't care. I made it out, and that was enough. I never went back. I never planned on staying at the cabin alone. It wasn't even my idea to begin with. My cousin, Ben, had suggested it. A quiet getaway, he called it. A week away from the noise, the stress, the endless scrolling on my phone. Just you, the trees, and the sound of the river, he'd said. He was supposed to come too, but 2 days before we were set to leave, he backed out. Work emergency, he claimed. He told me to go without him. Said the fresh air would do me good. I should have just canceled. The cabin was deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from any town. The nearest gas station was a 20-minute drive away, and cell service cut off about 5 miles from the property. It was a single-story place, old but well-maintained. The owners rented it out to hunters and hikers looking for solitude. Inside, it was basic: a small kitchen, a living area with an old couch, a wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just me and nature. The first night was fine, quiet, even peaceful. I built a fire in the stove, ate a can of chili, and read a book until I fell asleep. But the second night, things started feeling off. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound outside. It wasn't an animal. I'd grown up in a rural town. I knew the sounds of deer, raccoons, even bears. This was different. It was deliberate. Slow, careful footsteps moving through the leaves. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped just outside the cabin. My mind raced. Could have been another hiker, maybe someone lost. But why hadn't they called out? Why stop right outside my door? I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand and clicked it on. The steps didn't move. I waited, heart hammering. After what felt like forever, I heard them again, moving away this time, fading into the woods. I barely slept after that. In the morning, I checked outside. The leaves were disturbed near the window, but there were no clear footprints. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. The third night was worse. I forced myself to stay awake, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, the steps came from the back of the cabin. They stopped beneath the bedroom window. I held my breath. Then, a soft tapping sound. Not loud, just a light, careful tap against the glass. My stomach turned. I lay still, gripping the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. The tapping continued, slow, rhythmic. Then it stopped. I waited, listening. The air felt thick, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then, just as I started to think I imagined it, I heard the doorknob rattle. I sat up, heart pounding. The door was locked, but that didn't matter. Someone was out there, someone trying to get in. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then, footsteps again, retreating into the dark. I barely slept. The next morning, I packed my bag and threw it in the truck. I wanted to leave, but something in me told me to check around the cabin first. I walked the perimeter, looking for footprints, something to confirm what I already knew. And then I saw them. Behind the cabin, in the dirt near the window, were clear boot prints. Big ones. But what made my stomach drop was the fact that they weren't leading toward the cabin. They were leading away. Whoever had been standing there had been there before I even heard them. Standing, watching, waiting. I got in my truck and drove. Didn't even look back. I made it to the gas station, told the clerk what happened. He just shook his head. "You're not the first," he said. "People go up to that cabin thinking they'll be alone. They never are. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. I won't ever go back. And if you're ever in a place that feels too quiet, too isolated, trust your gut. You might not be as alone as you think." I had never been a fan of isolation. Something about being too far from people always unsettled me. I liked the idea of quiet, of nature, but true seclusion. That was something else entirely. So when my brother, Aaron, suggested that I spend a week alone in his remote cabin in Montana, I wasn't exactly eager. He framed it as an escape, a chance to clear my head, get away from the constant stress of work, and reset. I knew he meant well, so despite my hesitation, I agreed. I drove up there in early November, just before the heavy snows set in. The cabin was deep in the woods, a good 15 miles from the nearest town. It was a small structure built solidly but old. It had been our grandfather's, passed down to Aaron after he died. I had only been there once before, years ago, and I barely remembered it. The trees crowded thick around it, tall pines that blocked out most of the sky. There was a single dirt road leading up to it, barely wide enough for my truck. Once I parked and shut off the engine, the silence was overwhelming. No car horns, no voices, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant cry of some unseen animal. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, and a bathroom. Aaron had stocked the place with food and firewood before I arrived, which was good because there was no way I'd be making daily trips into town. The water was from a well, and there was no cell service. He had left a radio in case of emergencies, but other than that, I was completely cut off. The first night was uneventful. I read by lantern light, ate a can of soup, and listened to the wind howling outside. I was exhausted from the drive, so I fell asleep quickly. The bed was stiff, the blankets smelled a little musty, but I didn't mind. The next day, I spent my time hiking around the property, exploring the trails behind the cabin. There were animal tracks in the snow, mostly deer, but I saw some others I couldn't place. I wasn't a hunter or a tracker, so I just assumed they were from something harmless. It was the third night when things started to feel off. I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why. The cabin was pitch black, the only sound the faint creaking of wood settling. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps outside. They moved slowly, crunching through the thin layer of snow. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I stayed frozen, waiting. Minutes passed, then nothing, just silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, something looking for food. But deep down, I knew better. I barely slept after that, every little sound putting me on edge. When morning finally came, I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. There were footprints, human footprints. They led from the woods, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the trees. I tried to convince myself it was Aaron, checking in on me. Maybe he hadn't wanted to wake me, but I knew that was ridiculous. He had work, and besides, he would have told me if he was coming up. I decided not to dwell on it. Instead, I spent the day keeping myself busy, chopping wood, organizing supplies, anything to keep my mind off the footprints. That night, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. I kept the axe I'd been using earlier next to my bed, just in case. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I heard it again. This time, the sound wasn't footsteps. It was something brushing against the cabin walls. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, gripping the axe so tight my hands hurt. Then came the tapping, faint, rhythmic, right against the wooden door. A single knock, a pause, then another. My stomach twisted. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, slow and steady. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but it was too precise, too intentional. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The next morning, I found something on the porch, a dead rabbit. Its neck had been snapped, its body laid out neatly right in front of the door. I stared at it for a long time, trying to process what it meant. Animals didn't leave their kills like that. People did. I should have left, right then and there, but I didn't. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Someone was messing with me. Maybe a hunter who had stumbled across the cabin and decided to play a joke. I spent the day inside, keeping the axe close, waiting for night to fall. Came too fast. That night, the knocking returned. Louder this time, more forceful. It started at the door, then moved to the walls, as if someone was testing the structure, looking for a way in. I sat in the dark, gripping the axe, waiting. Then I heard it, something sliding against the window pane. A shadow shifted against the glass. My blood went cold. Someone was out there, watching. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, the noises stopped, but I didn't sleep. Not that night. The next morning, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up what little I had brought, grabbed the keys to my truck, and stepped outside. The cold air burned my lungs. The ground was covered in fresh snow, but I could see them. Footprints. Dozens of them. They circled the cabin, leading in and out of the woods. I started toward the truck. That's when I saw it. The hood was open. Someone had been inside. I popped the latch, dread pooling in my stomach. The engine was ruined, wires cut, parts ripped out. I was stranded. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. The radio. I had the emergency radio inside. I ran back to the cabin, bolted the door, and grabbed it. My hands shook as I twisted the dial, trying to find a frequency. Static. Just static. I tried for hours. Nothing. By nightfall, I had given up. My only option was to wait for Aaron. He was supposed to check in on me at the end of the week. I just had to make it 3 more days. That night, they came back. Multiple people. I could hear them moving outside, whispering. Low, hushed voices. They tried the door, the windows. I stayed in the corner, axe in hand, heart pounding so hard I thought it would kill me. They didn't get in. The next 2 nights were the same. More footprints, more whispers, more knocking, but they never broke inside. On the morning of the 7th day, I heard the sound of an engine. Aaron's truck. I ran outside before he even got out, barely able to get the words out. He saw my face, my fear, and he didn't question it. We left everything behind. I never went back. Aaron hired someone to check the place out. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Just an empty cabin in the middle of nowhere, like nothing had ever happened. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't know why I agreed to watch my uncle's cabin for the weekend. Maybe it was the way he asked, his voice sounding almost desperate over the phone. Maybe it was because I owed him a favor after he helped me move last year. Either way, I said yes, and now I was here, alone, in the middle of nowhere. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 15 miles from the nearest small town. It wasn't a modern, cozy retreat either. It was an old, single-story log cabin that had been in the family for decades. My uncle barely used it, only coming up every now and then to fish or escape the city. He told me there was a generator, but he warned me that the power could be spotty. There was no cell service. If I needed anything, I'd have to drive about a mile down the road where the reception was a little better. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, heated up some canned soup, and read a book. The quiet was unsettling, but I pushed through it. I heard some noises outside, branches breaking, the wind rustling through the trees, but I told myself it was just nature doing its thing. The second night, I started feeling uneasy. Something was off. Started around midnight. I had just turned off the lantern and was settling into the creaky bed when I heard something outside. A thud. Not the usual snapping branches or the sound of a small animal moving through the brush. This was something heavy, something deliberate. Came from the front porch. I held my breath and listened. The wind howled outside, making the trees groan. The fire had died down to embers, casting the room in faint orange light. Then, another sound. A slow, dragging scrape across the wooden porch. I sat up, my heart hammering. My uncle had mentioned that sometimes deer wandered up to the cabin, but this didn't sound like an animal. It was too slow, too heavy. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated. I wanted to check, but I also didn't. Every instinct told me to stay put. But then the noise stopped. For minutes, maybe even an hour, I sat there listening. Nothing, just the wind again. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that maybe a branch had fallen, or the wind had knocked something over. Morning came and I went outside to check the porch. The first thing I noticed was that the welcome mat had been moved. It was now halfway down the steps, like someone had kicked it. My stomach twisted. I walked around the cabin, looking for footprints, but the ground was too hard, too covered in leaves to make anything out. Still, I felt watched. That feeling you get when someone's staring at you, but you can't see them. I tried to shake it off and spent the day keeping myself busy. I chopped some wood, checked the generator, and even took a short walk down the trail. By the time the sun started setting, I convinced myself that I had just imagined things. That night, I locked everything. The doors, the windows. I even barricaded the front door with a chair. I kept my flashlight and a knife by my bed. The noises started again, but this time they were closer. A soft creak, like weight shifting on the porch. Then the doorknob rattled. I stopped breathing. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. The rattling stopped, but then, slow, deliberate footsteps circled the cabin. One by one, moving along the walls, pausing near the windows. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife so tight my hand ached. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom window. The curtains were drawn, but I could feel something or someone on the other side. Then a tap, just once. Then another. I wanted to run. I wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting. Eventually, the sounds stopped. The wind picked up again, covering any trace of movement. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if my uncle needed me to stay. I packed my bag in record time and stepped onto the porch, my eyes scanning the tree line. Then I saw them. Footprints. Large, heavy footprints leading from the woods to the cabin. They circled the entire building. They were fresh. And the worst part? There were no footprints leading away.